She's going to start.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to the Writers Project of Ghana's Author of the Month series for July 2021. My name is Elizabeth Johnson and you are joining us live from the Goethe-Institut. We are also live on YouTube, on Facebook and on Instagram at Writers PG, so you can join us. We are also on Zoom. And so I'd like to say that this month we are actually hosting Yaa Gyasi, and with me to do the interviews is Mamle Kabu. So I'll pass on to her to introduce our guest.
We're very excited to have Yaa Gyasi as our guest for this edition of Ghana Voices. Yaa Gyasi is the author of Homegoing, which was published in 2016 to great acclaim, and Transcendent Kingdom, published in 2020. Homegoing is in the genre of historical fiction and was a Sunday Times bestseller. It won the National Book Critics Award for Best First Novel and was shortlisted for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for a debut novel. In 2017, Yaa Gyasi was selected as one of Granta's best young American novelists. And in 2019, the BBC selected Homegoing as one of the 100 novels that shaped our world. Her second book, Transcendent Kingdom, was longlisted for the 2020 Prix Medici Étranger and the 2021 Penn Faulkner Award for Fiction. It was also shortlisted for the 2021 Women's Prize for Fiction. Yaa Gyasi was born in Mampong and raised in Huntsville, Alabama. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in English at Stanford University and a Master of Fine Arts from the Iowa Writers Workshop. In 2020, she was awarded the Wilczek Prize for Creative Promise in Literature. Please join me to welcome Yaa Gyasi. Elizabeth recently hosted an edition of the Writers Project of Ghana's book club in which Transcendent Kingdom was discussed, and it really was quite a fascinating and enjoyable session. Elizabeth is very passionate about the book, and I would like to hand over to her to ask the opening questions.
Yes, so this was actually in May, and we had two guest reviewers, as we do on the book club show, one from Kenya and one from Ghana. And aside my views, the views that were shared on the show were really interesting and very passionate views that we got. And so my first question would be that I'd like to hear your thoughts on how you feel about your books coming into the world and gaining so much acclaim. And most recently, Transcendent Kingdom has been shortlisted for the 2021 Women's Prize. And so I really would like to hear your thoughts on how you feel about your books doing so well, especially after the first book. Did you feel any sort of pressure to kind of meet up to expectations when Transcendent Kingdom was coming out?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you all for having me. Thank you to the audience for coming. It's my pleasure to be here. This has all been really beyond my wildest dreams or expectations. I think the common wisdom is that you write your first novel with this sense of freedom and possibility. There's no guarantee that anyone will even buy the book. And so to experience any amount of success is really more than you can dream of. I liken it to spending years writing in the dark, unsure of whether or not your book will see the light of day. And so for Homegoing to have seen the light and for the light to have been so bright is really astonishing to me. And then coming off of that book, I did feel some amount of pressure as to what to do next and whether or not the second book would also be well received. I think an awareness of audience kind of crept in a way that it hadn't for Homegoing. I think with any first book, you can kind of pretend that perhaps no one will ever read it, and that allows you a kind of freedom that you don't have after you publish a book to acclaim. Suddenly there is an understanding that people will want to read the thing that you write. And so with that comes a kind of new sense of responsibility that I didn't feel the first time around. That said, I think the thing that helps is to kind of put it out of your mind. as best you can, and remember that each book is different, each book is new, and you get to try new things, and that's the pleasure of fiction, is to kind of stretch your imagination. So it felt really nice to work on something different, and to kind of free myself from that feeling of needing to be beholden to what I had done the first time.
I'm happy that you actually mentioned that both books are different, because Homegoing is historical fiction and Transcendence is so different. I mean, if I was to read the books blindly, I wouldn't even guess that both books were written by the same author. So my next question would be that with the second book following hot on the heels of the success of your first story, do you think that there are connections between the two in terms of the style, the content, or even the characters and the inspiration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think there's some continuity between the first and second books. They are both about family. Obviously, Homegoing takes that to the extreme and has this large canvas. But Transcendent Kingdom is also about family on a more intimate scale. They are also both, I think, about what I think of as the scars that we inherit from our family members, from our ancestors, our parents, the kind of generational trauma that is passed down from person to person. Again, Transcendent Kingdom does this on a more intimate scale, but it's still concerned with that. There's a bit of religion in both of the books, more so in Transcendent Kingdom. But other than that, as you said, stylistically, they're very, very different novels, and they kind of take up different concerns in a way that I think allowed me to play and to kind of try something new, and to think differently than I had thought for the first book.
So if you're just joining us, this is the Writers Project of Ghana. We are hosting Yaa Gyasi, and we will be taking questions from our audience live at the Goethe-Institut. Also, those who are joining on Zoom, you can leave your questions in the message box, and we will take them. If you're on Instagram or Facebook, same for you. So we will take a first reading, but before we do that, I'd just like to ask a follow-up question. Since you raised the topic of family, which is in both Homegoing and Transcendent Kingdom. And it seems to me, reading both books, that you are very interested in the theme of family, be it family conflicts or family, the impact of generational, the impact of decisions made by families on generations to come, and also relationships and religion. So I'd like you to touch on why family is such an important thing to you as an author.
Well, it's an obsession of mine in great part because I grew up without my extended family. I grew up with this very small scale, just my parents and my brothers, because we came to America when I was so young. And so I used to, more so when I was younger than these days, but I used to spend a lot of time wondering, who I would be if I had gotten to stay in Ghana and been around my grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, and how would that have shaped me? Had my parents not made this decision to come here, what would my life look like? That kind of a thought exercise of understanding that so much of what we think to be kind of innate or inherent to us is in fact a result of decisions that are outside of our control, decisions that people made before we even arrived. I find that really fascinating. And so I think that's just kind of a personal obsession of mine that comes to play in both of the books.
Mamle, any comments?
Well, I would like to talk more about that issue of identity after the first reading. So, if you don't mind, could we have a reading from you now?
Sure. I'll just read from the very beginning of Transcendent Kingdom. Whenever I think of my mother, I picture a queen-sized bed with her lying in it, a practiced stillness filling the room. For months on end, she colonized that bed like a virus. The first time when I was a child, and then again when I was a graduate student. The first time I was sent to Ghana to wait her out. While there, I was walking through Kejitia Market with my aunt when she grabbed my arm and pointed. "Look, a crazy person," she said, intrigued. "Do you see a crazy person?" I was mortified. My aunt was speaking so loudly, and the man, tall, with dust caked into his dreadlocks, was within earshot. I see, I answered in a low hiss. The man continued past us, mumbling to himself as he waved his hands about in gestures that only he could understand. My aunt nodded, satisfied, and we kept walking, past the hordes of people gathered in that agoraphobia-inducing market, until we reached the stall where we would spend the rest of the morning attempting to sell knockoff handbags. In my 3 months there, we sold only 4 bags. Even now, I don't completely understand why my aunt singled the man out to me. Maybe she thought there were no crazy people in America, that I had never seen one before. Or maybe she was thinking about my mother, about the real reason I was stuck in Ghana that summer, sweating in a stall with an aunt hardly knew while my mother healed at home in Alabama. I was 11, and I could see that my mother wasn't sick, not in the ways that I was used to. I didn't understand what my mother needed healing from. I didn't understand, but I did. And my embarrassment at my aunt's loud gesture had as much to do with my understanding as it did with the man who passed us by. My aunt was saying that is what crazy looks like. But instead, what I heard was my mother's name. What I saw was my mother's face, still as lake water, the pastor's hand resting gently on her forehead. His prayer, a light hum that made the room buzz. I'm not sure I know what crazy looks like, but even today, when I hear the word, I picture a split screen, the dreadlocked man in Kejitia on one side, my mother lying in bed on the other. I think about how no one at all reacted to that man in the market, not in fear or disgust, nothing, save my aunt, who wanted me to look. He was, it seemed to me, at perfect peace, even as he gesticulated wildly, even as he mumbled. But my mother, in her bed, infinitely still, was wild inside. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, yeah. There was a dichotomy there between so-called sanity and insanity, what is recognized as which. There is also underpinning it a cultural diversity. There is the flashback between Ghana and the US, Alabama, Kejitia market. So that leads me back to the question of identity, which is strongly present in both of your novels. I came across a quote from you from a previous interview, which I'd like to share here as a background to the question I'd like to ask you regarding identity. You said, this book, and sorry, speaking about Homegoing, your first novel, this book constitutes my discovery of and inquiry into questions that I'd always had, both as an African immigrant and as an African American. I started the book with a question that I put at the top of my screen. What does it mean to be Black in America? This book is me thinking through a lot of these issues of racial and ethnic identity. It would be so different if I had written it in Ghana, or was just American and wrote it from that perspective. It helps to have this sense of being in the middle. This book comes from a place of always feeling like I wasn't Ghanaian enough for Ghana, and not African American enough for the United States. So it will also be interesting to see how Ghanaian critics respond to it. Because I can imagine getting the opposite side of the critique, where they think my treatment of the African American characters is nuanced. I don't know what to do about that. I've always existed in this weird, murky space where someone is allowed to say, I'm not either thing if they are that thing. I was born in Ghana, then I lived in Ohio, Illinois, Tennessee, and then Alabama. I moved around a lot, and I think that this book reflects that kind of restlessness of place. I came from a country that had involvement in the slave trade. Then I ended up in a place where the effects of slavery are still so strongly felt, and it's something that I was unconsciously navigating my entire childhood. Going home to Ghanaian parents and being told all the ways that I wasn't African American, then leaving my house and being African American to the rest of the world, and trying to figure out what that meant for me. All of that is in this book. Questions of identity as it pertains to ethnicity and race and country. End of quote. Now, I also write about identity being biracial, and it's a thing that I find involuntarily comes up again and again in my writing. And I've spoken to quite a few Ghanaian writers in the diaspora who struggle with similar identity issues. And for some of them, that thing of people saying they're not enough of one thing or the other can be a deterrent to writing or expressing themselves at all. I'm wondering, did writing Homegoing help you through that challenge? And if so, what advice would you have for other writers who feel that way?
That's a good question. Writing Homegoing did help me through that challenge. I should start by saying I was really young when I started Homegoing. I was 19. I was still in college when I got the fellowship to travel to Ghana to start researching that novel. So I think it was, all of those questions were really front of mind in a way that they, as I got older, stopped being as pertinent to me. And so I think so much of my childhood leading up to those years where I started to think about homegoing were consumed with this, as I was saying before, this kind of obsession with trying to find a place for myself and feeling as though I did not have a place, feeling like kind of limited by this sense of having only my nuclear family as the people who could kind of understand me culturally from an identity standpoint. And so homegoing was, in some ways, I think, about kind of giving myself a history that I was lacking otherwise. And it felt, people talk about writing feeling cathartic, but it felt like the only way that I could do that, the only way that I could feel a part of something was to write it, to give it to myself. And so in that way, the writing kind of is the solution to the problem. Like it helps you to deal with whatever those questions are that you are asking. So if I were to give advice, it would be to do it anyway, even if you're uncertain about your place, even if you feel as though you're kind of outside of something. If you write your way into it, you create the space, like you create a place, and that can be, for lack of a better way of putting it, like that can be healing to whatever that thing is inside of you. That how other people read it, how other people respond to it is a separate question. But in terms of what you get out of it, it's important to try.
Yes, I think that's a very good way to put it. In Homegoing, there is a character called Kwe, who articulates this dilemma directly. And to quote from page 56, Kwe had wanted to cry, but that desire embarrassed him. He knew that he was one of the half-caste children of the castle. This is Cape Coast Castle in Cape Coast. And like the other half-caste children, he could not fully claim either half of himself, neither his father's whiteness nor his mother's blackness, neither England nor the Gold Coast. Now, whether the color is involved or not, it's the same type of issue. So here it's almost like an echo of what you said in your interview. Do you feel then that you're kind of more at peace about this issue now that you've written Homegoing, you've kind of got it out of your system? Do you feel that way at all?
I do. I think it certainly the writing was helpful, but I think in some ways too, just kind of getting it out on the table and seeing people's response to it, the full range of people's response to it, kind of relinquished some element of control that I was still holding over these questions. Like it doesn't bother me as much anymore, because no one can define it for me. I can only define it for myself. So I do feel a lot more at ease, certainly than I did at 20, at 25.
So the answer is right. Okay, and you tackle some other heavy themes such as mental health. You open with that in Transcendent Kingdom. slavery, interracial marriage, migration, and so forth. Could you tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind those themes?
Sure. I mean, for homegoing, it was very visceral and direct. It was because I was visiting Ghana in order to, at the time, I wanted to write something different. I thought I was going to write about my mother's hometown, and so my goal had been to go to the central region and kind of see if anything came up for me. A friend had come to visit, and so he and I and my cousins went to the Cape Coast Castle, and that was the beginning of that book. Just thinking about that place and that sense of haunting. So I always kind of knew from the beginning, or at the beginning of that trip at least, that it would be about slavery in some capacity. For Transcendent Kingdom, thinking about the kind of the larger themes of this novel. As you said, mental illness, addiction. Part of that came about because I was doing research into the neuroscience that underpins this novel. So for those who don't know, the novel is about a neuroscientist named Gifty, whose mother comes to stay with her. And that work that Gifty does, I modeled after my friend Tina's work. So it kind of started from thinking about it from the kind of the science perspective, and then, working my way out from there. So it's different every time, but it never feels, I don't know, like I never start with the themes first, so it's hard to say. It usually is just a thinking about character, and then the themes creep in from there.
Right. Elizabeth, any comment on that?
Yeah, so I would like to ask and maybe make a comment about the transcendent kingdom and what we've been discussing so far. And so for me, the way identity is highlighted in both books is very different, but I'm particularly interested in the way it is highlighted in Transcendent Kingdom. It's almost as if even in the chapter that you read, which is the first chapter, we see that Gifty, who even with her life in the US, is struggling a lot with identity and wants to feel at home, wants to feel like she belongs, even with her parents. And then at the moment at which she is in Ghana is when she feels her worst, when she feels her worst, so to put it. So I really want to hear your thoughts on what inspires your writing on the topic of identity in the context of no matter who you are as a human being, you definitely will feel a sense of being lost no matter where you are.
Yeah, well, Gifty is a character who I think of as being kind of doubly isolated. She's isolated because of the fact that her family immigrates to America, but she's also, once they get to America, they end up living on the predominantly white side of this town, and so she's quite dives into it. Her mother does not attempt to recreate community in America. It talks about how her mother kind of very rarely makes the drive to go to the gatherings of other Ghanaians. And so Gifty really does grow up without a sense of herself as Ghanaian. When she arrives in Ghana, it's the first time that she hears that she has an aunt. Her mother hasn't even told her about her sister. And so that those kind of layers of isolation, those layers of loneliness are what inform Gifty's character, Gifty's personality. Everything that she does is out of that sense of being adrift and of kind of trying to figure out how to navigate those spaces that she is technically a part of, but in fact outside of. And, going back to things that we've been discussing this whole time, it's just it's one of my own personal interests, is thinking about how place and particularly like liminal spaces inform who we are.
I think that we could open for questions if there are any
at this point.
Yeah. So we'll first take from our audience joining us live here, and then we'll check if there are questions on Zoom, Instagram, or Facebook. So any questions from our live audience? No?
Not yet.
Zoom.
No, there's this one over there,
Okay.
Aziza. Hi. Mhm. Yeah, mic. Oh, can we not send the mic? Yes. Good evening. Thanks for coming.
When we know it's so much more nuanced. I mean, there's a very simplistic aspects of it, but it's so much more nuanced, you know. And I'm always challenging and thinking about this. The one can be so many. When you can have so many identities, you know, and then you can. It's about also about worldview, how you connect with other people. You finding your tribe. I think it's a human need to find the tribe.
Absolutely.
You know, I think we all need to belong, but the belonging doesn't have to be on the basis of the culture, the country, the religion. It's quite often the intellectual or emotional connectedness. And I just wanted to hear your view on that perspective, because we're so often put into these pigeonholes, which most people don't fit into anymore. The world is, maybe they never fitted into. Maybe it was less homogenous before, and things were more fluid. Maybe it has become more distilled and more simplistic, and human beings are complex, we're nuanced. And I'd just like to hear your view on this, allowing for this, the diversity of identity and people not having to fit into these shoe boxes, you know. Thank you.
Thank you, Aziza. Yes.
Yes.
So
I absolutely agree with that. I think, going back to when Mamle asked me if I was still kind of struggling with those questions of identity that I was in my younger years, part of the reason that I'm not any longer is because I'm able to recognize that nuance that you're talking about, that everything can be true all at once and nothing can be true all at once, and no one gets to tell you. You make it yourself, and you find whatever community speaks to you yourself as you grow. And so hopefully with both of these books, there's an interest in the kind of multiplicity of identity that is possible, that is, as you say, much more nuanced, much more complex than just saying you're this or that or the other. Part of the reason I think about this a lot is not just that I, immigrated to America, but also once we got to America, I lived in many different states here. And what I discovered is, as I moved around, is that so much of who we think we are is informed by place. But now that we're kind of living in a society or in a time where people are kind of intermixing, moving around, recreating the strictures that used to define us, they no longer serve us. And so how do you create a sense of yourself in a world that is kind of starting to blend? I find that really interesting, and I think you're right. It's about a capaciousness. It's about opening out your thinking about who we are.
Yeah, that's right.
So we have a few other questions. There's this one which is coming in from Facebook, and it's from Makusi. And she says, "Yeah, you are my favorite author. Sending you my love from Botswana. Thank you, Mamle and Elizabeth. I love how you structured your writing. Also, I took a tour of the castles, and you wrote in spirit." And then there is another one, and this is coming from Facebook, I believe, and this is from Dako Intri. And Dako is asking if he can get a quote of the statement that preceded the last question on identity. So maybe we'll find a way of sending you exactly that quote, unless Mamle could tell us where it is from. Thank you.
Yes, we can certainly get that information given to the audience. Yes. Okay. Yeah, could we invite you to do a second reading, please?
Sure. I'll read this next one from near the end of Homegoing. This is Marcus's chapter, and Marcus is the last character on the American side of the lineage, and he's expressing frustration with his work that kind of reflected my own frustrations with trying to write Homegoing. Originally, he'd wanted to focus his work on the convict leasing system that had stolen years off of his great-grandpa H's life. But the deeper into the research he got, the bigger the project got. How could he talk about great-grandpa H's story without also talking about his grandma Willie and the millions of other Black people who had migrated north, fleeing Jim Crow? And if he mentioned the Great Migration, he'd have to talk about the cities that took that flock in. He'd have to talk about Harlem. And how could he talk about Harlem without mentioning his father's heroin fiction, the stints in prison, the criminal record? And if he was going to talk about heroin in Harlem in the 60s, wouldn't he also have to talk about crack everywhere in the 80s? And if he wrote about crack, he'd inevitably be writing too about the war on drugs. And if he started talking about the war on drugs, he'd be talking about how nearly half of the Black men he grew up with were on their way either into or out of what had become the harshest prison system in the world. And if he talked about why friends from his neighborhood were doing 5-year bids for possession of marijuana, when nearly all of the white people he'd gone to college with smoked it openly every day, he'd get so angry that he'd slam the research book on the table of the beautiful but deadly silent Lane Reading Room of Green Library of Stanford University. If he slammed the book down, then everyone in the room would stare at him, and all they would see would be his skin and his anger, and they'd think that they knew something about him, and it would be the same something that had justified putting his great-grandpa H in prison, only it would be different, too, less obvious than it once was. When Marcus started to think this way, he couldn't get himself to open even one book. Sorry.
Thank you so much, yeah. Now, Homegoing catapulted you onto the global stage, receiving a plethora of nominations and becoming one of the most cited contemporary books. It's a novel that spans at least 3 centuries, and many. It cuts across space and time in a sweeping fashion. It's quite epic. However, it's also come in for some criticism and questions about its cultural accuracy and historical veracity, especially here in Ghana, of course, where quite a lot of it is based. Now, to quote you in a 2016 interview, "My intention was not to make the novel stiff with research. I did enough to get my imagination flowing, and then I wanted to let the characters do what they were going to do. Sometimes I read a historical novel and I feel like it was just an opportunity for the writer to tell you everything that they learned about the history in that time period. And you kind of lose the character and the story and those kinds of things that make me want to read fiction in the first place, rather than reading a historical text. And so I didn't want this book to feel that way. I felt like if I ever came to this crossroads where I would have to decide between the plot and historical fact, that I was going to choose plot. I generally tended to privilege my imagination over historical fact. Now, of course, this is the prerogative of the fiction writer. However, this is historical fiction, and there are diverse viewpoints about what a writer should do and so forth. Now, you wrote the novel; it was very successful, and it's a work of fiction at the end of the day. However, some readers and indeed other writers who have also published historical fiction about Ghana have taken issue with some of the details in Homegoing. Some have suggested you could have just used a fictional African country so that there would be no issue about veracity or accuracy. Some have also spoken about the responsibility to represent Africa accurately, given our post-colonial burden of misrepresentation. What is your response to this, and how important are cultural accuracy and historical veracity to you, given that your work is fictional?
Yes, I mean, I think that when I started the novel, my main goal was that timeline. It was the larger timeline. I wanted to be able to see this full sweep of history. And given that, I understood that in order to kind of capture the whole, I would have to kind of relinquish some fidelity to the parts. And so it was a book that privileged a certain way of thinking, a certain structure over, as I said in that quote, I guess, over the kind of pieces. A book that privileged the whole over the pieces. And I do think, as you said, like if you asked 10 different writers to give you their opinion of how much fidelity a historical novel should have to what we think of as the truth, you would get 10 different answers. But for me, part of the pleasure of fiction, part of the pleasure of any narrative writing, I would argue even memoir, even kind of creative nonfiction, is in the shaping. It's in the and once you start to shape something, once you start to kind of give something an order and impose a kind of sense of structure that it did not have, you begin to degrade it. You begin to kind of move away from what we think of as true. And so in that way, the book is its own thing. Like it's not ever going to be a historical text. And I'm not ever going to call myself a scholar or a historian. I'm a fiction writer first and foremost. Interestingly, when I was writing it, part of it, I was in graduate school, and a friend of mine there who wanted to write about his own home country, we started talking about whether or not you should use a fictionalized place. And what became clear to me through that conversation is that the impulse to do that is often driven from a desire to escape criticism about not having ownership of the place, like not being truly of that place. And that feels to me to be a kind of cheapening. It's great. Like if I had set this in Macondo, who knows what kind of criticism I would get. And it's valid. I understand where it comes from, but for me, again, the point of this and the reason I wanted to write this and the framework that I wanted to use to write this had so much more to do with that sweep of time, even if that meant that some things would have to fall by the wayside. I was okay with that. I think there's a version of this novel that would have taken me 10 years to write, that I might never have finished, that would be 1,000 pages long. I didn't want any of that. I wanted the story. And again, I understand if people hear that and think that that's not sufficient, that there's more of a responsibility. But I feel like that burden of responsibility to a place often falls on the shoulders of marginalized people in the way that it doesn't for other people. And part of writing fiction is being free.
I like that last quote. Yeah. So related to that, what gave you the confidence to set so much of your writing in Ghana when you have lived mostly outside of Ghana?
I'm not sure what gave me the confidence. I suppose I could answer that question by wondering, how much time, what is the requisite amount of time that I should have lived in Ghana in order to be able to write about it. I can't really say. Like, I feel like so much of my life is informed by Ghana, even if I have not lived there for all of my life. And so it would feel foreign to write about something other than Ghana in some ways. Even as it feels foreign to write about Ghana. This goes back to all of the stuff we were talking about earlier. Like, where can I write about? What can I write? Who can I write? If not the things that I have been writing. If I were to only write fiction about people who immigrated to the States when they were 2, it would be incredibly limiting. And so, in order to kind of allow myself a sense of permissiveness, I must write about the places that I know.
Okay. Should we perhaps bring in questions from the audience at this point, if there's any more questions, especially on this topic? Yeah. Our live audience first. Are there any questions or comments?
Okay, so we have a few questions coming in from Instagram. So there's this one which is coming in from Lutard, and Lutard is saying that this is really great. This is a really great event. Well done to you all writers project. And then we have something from Owusua Achao, and says, how do you feel when you come to Ghana? Do you fit in here? Are you lost where you belong to? And that's a question coming in from Owusua Achao Joseph on Instagram. And then there is one other one. Let's try and find it. And it says, okay, so this one says, how do you feel when you come to Ghana? Do you, all right, that's the one I just read. Okay. So those are the messages that we have on IG and Facebook. There's one other one that came in through Zoom. I'll fetch that and I'll read it out shortly.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth, any questions or comments for Yaa?
Yeah, just to the question that came from Instagram about being lost and in Ghana or in the USA, I believe that she did speak a bit about it in her previous answer. But if there's something you'd want to say in response to all the comments you've heard, Yaa, please do go ahead.
I don't think I feel lost when I'm in Ghana. Like I do have enough of a sense of kind of continuity that that it feels like it fits in some ways. Like most of my family is in Kumasi, so when I go, that's where I go. And I get to see all of my aunts and uncles and cousins who I don't see normally. And so it feels like there's a place for me there. You know, there's a continuity of language because I grew up speaking and hearing Twi. I think it'd be harder if I didn't have those things, but because I have them, I feel at home.
So here's this one from Josiah Ryan, and he is sending this via Zoom. And he says, "Good day, Yaa. Thank you for your books and tonight. My question is twofold. First, is there any ritual preparation before writing? And then how do you separate yourself from your writing such that you don't overly divulge your life? Not that it's bad to share, but is there ever a guided personality or self-preservation, so to speak?"
Good one.
That's an interesting question. As far as ritual, I don't have a lot of ritual around writing. When I was writing Homegoing, I wrote much of it when I was in graduate school in Iowa, and so a lot of my days could be devoted to writing the book in a way that it couldn't at other points. And so I suppose if I had any ritual then, it was getting up and going to my desk and sitting and kind of banging my head against the table for a few hours to see if anything came out. But I'm not the kind of person who needs the same cup and the same pen and has to have the same seat at the coffee shop. Like I can write almost anywhere. I can write with noise. I don't have those kinds of strictures. As to your second question about self-preservation or kind of keeping a part of yourself aside when you're writing, that's interesting. I mean, I do believe that it's helpful to me, to my writing, to kind of keep my private life as private as possible. Like I'm not really very present online. I do try to kind of protect some of myself. But when it comes to the writing, when it comes to the fiction, I think whether or not you think of what you're writing as autobiographical, there are parts of you that creep into the novel despite yourself. And I think of these things almost as a kind of scaffolding. Like you start with them to build up the novel, to hold up the novel, and then you discard them as you go. They become less important. So if it's yourself, it's like looking at yourself in a funhouse mirror. It's so distorted that you don't recognize it at the end of the day. And in that way, you can preserve yourself. I find it really hard to finish something and feel as though, feel exposed in a way. Maybe I would feel differently if I were writing memoir or writing nonfiction, writing about my life. But fiction always starts to I used the word degrade before, but that might not be right. It always shifts things around in a way that distorts it.
So, still on the issue of your writing, both Homegoing and Transcendent Kingdom have a lot of characters in them. Particularly Transcendent Kingdom, the way in which you write the story, from the get-go, we do see that Gifty is the main character. However, in reading the lives of all the characters, there's a way in which you are able to center stage them. So then at the end, it's really hard to, it's really hard to see who exactly is the main character. And so my question is, how are you as a writer able to, write so many characters and write them so well that they stand out at the end of all your stories?
I think character is the most important thing. I think about it first in any project. And I heard a writer who I really admire, Kazuo Ishiguro. I heard him talk once, and he said something like, when he's thinking about the relationships between the characters, then suddenly it all starts to make sense. He doesn't have to focus on the character, him or herself. He can just think about that character in relationship to everyone else. Because in order to be real in a relationship, you have to be real. And I liked that way of putting it. So when you're writing multiple characters, part of what you're thinking about is what these characters mean to each other. And in doing that, you start to flesh them out automatically. You have to. Because for Gifty to be real, she has to be real to Nana. For Nana to be real, he has to be real to Gifty. And in that way, you start to kind of build them out without even trying to. But it's hard to be more direct in speaking about it than that. It's a work of it's work that takes time and practice, and it almost feels like listening to who these characters want to tell you that they are, and allowing them to appear in that way.
You speak of writing, because of the number of characters that you put in your story, speak of them taking so much time. And so my next question is that Homegoing and Transcendent Kingdom, which of the stories came first to you?
Oh, sorry, you were frozen for part of that.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
you said
so
your next question,
yeah, so
and then you cut out.
Okay, so my question is really taking both books, Homegoing and Transcendent Kingdom, and the fact that you mentioned that because of the number of characters you put in your book, it takes a lot of time to write them. I really would like to know which of the stories came to you first, despite one coming before the other.
Homegoing was the first. It came first. I wrote it first. I had been the trajectory of that is that I started it kind of broadly when I was in college, but I wasn't devoting myself to it that intensely. And then once I graduated college, started grad school, I started to get serious about writing that novel. But the full scope of that took 7 years. And then around the time I finished the first draft of Homegoing, I started working on a short story that was about a woman whose mother was a Gerard Manley Hopkins scholar, or who was a Gerard Manley Hopkins scholar whose mother came to stay with her. And that story was kind of the bud that created Transcendent Kingdom. And Transcendent Kingdom took me about 2 years. But I thought about them and wrote them in the order that they were published, I guess. I don't write simultaneously. I don't write multiple things at once. I just kind of do one after the other.
I see a few hands up, so I'll take the questions. But before I do, I'd like to ask, still speaking about both books, which of the genres would you write in again?
I mean, hopefully I will stay open to writing in whatever genre, whatever kind of vessel the story requires. I like that feeling of like letting the work tell you what it wants to be. I'm not a big pre-planner, so it does feel like I'm just discovering what the genre is, what the story is as I write. So hard for me to say I wouldn't ever write in this way again, that way again. I'm not sure what will happen next, but I enjoyed parts of both books, parts of both writing experiences. And so whatever the book requires is what I will do.
Okay. I'd like now to take some questions that we have. So I'll first start with the audience here.
Good afternoon to you. Good evening to everyone here.
Good evening.
Thank you so much, one, for Writers Project of Ghana hosting this. I just found out about this yesterday, and I was ecstatic. So I've read and taught your book a couple times, Homegoing, and I'm looking forward to teaching and reading Transcendent Kingdom soon. One thing I really loved about Homegoing, especially as someone who, for my own life journey, as a Nigerian born in the United States, was always trying to find that connection between both worlds where it felt very similar to me. But as you've expressed, that each side will kind of remind you that you're not fully part of either society. And I think you did that really well in this book, because one thing that my students really recognized was that, or I made sure they recognized, is that by the end of the book, you as a reader know firsthand, there's no dispute, to both ancestries' connection back to these two sisters. So even if the characters don't know their history, you as the reader do, and you're able to trace that back. And so when you have these two characters, the Marcus and then the Ghanaian, what's her name again?
Marjorie.
Okay, Marjorie and Marcus. I like that they said the M too, like the E's in the beginning. But that when they come at the end, like, I thought it was brilliant that you never even made it that they knew that somehow they were distant relatives, but their spirit, came together, that somehow they connected. And you're even thinking, as Marjorie gives this, does she give the stone, or does she throw the stone? I forgot exactly how it went, but just how these two things came together. I just thought it was beautiful how this can happen many times for us, as whether it's Black Americans or Black Brazilians or Ghanaians or Namibians, whatever the case may be, that when we're amongst each other, we never know how we are connected. And I thought that it was beautiful, indisputable evidence of our unity and as African people globally. So I just wanted to maybe, as more of a comment than a question, but definitely was interested in Marjorie and Marcus, your decision perhaps for them not to, why bring them together? Like, what was your thought behind bringing this huge narrative together with these two characters? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. That it's wonderful to hear you say all of that, because I think I was thinking about so much of that as I was writing. So it's nice that you and your students picked up on those issues. I knew from the beginning that I wanted the two sides to meet. There was never any question of that. In fact, when I started the novel, initially I thought it was going to be set in the present, just with those last two characters, though at the time they looked different than they ended up looking in their final form, and that I would just kind of flash back every once in a while to 18th century Ghana. Because to me, it was more about that connection, that ability to bring these two sides together, whether or not they knew that they were in some way related to each other. It felt important that they meet. So it's the only time that I've kind of known the ending from the beginning, but I was always writing toward that.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Okay. So while the audience takes the stage, I'd just like to remind you that you are joining the Writers Project of Ghana, a literary organization based in Ghana. And tonight on our Author of the Month series, we are hosting Ghanaian American writer Yaa Gyasi. She is the author of 2 books, Homegoing and Transcendent Kingdom.
Yeah, hi, yeah. How you doing? So my question is really to do about religion and science, because really, you really throw them against each other in Transcendent Kingdom. And after I read it, I sort of asked my other friends, how did they think about the book? And it was kind of like a sizing up, see how religious you were, right? It's like, you message me in private and let's talk about it. And it's like, yeah, what did you think about the book? And it's like, oh, it was good, but there was like, so in Ghana we're very, very religious. So I wanted to know, from your Ghanaian audience, what was the reaction to Transcendent Kingdom? Because for me, I'm not a religious person, so for me, it was very brilliant to see this battle or this versus of science and religion. So I wanted to just ask you about that, and also, was it a concentrated effort to bring these two things against each other in the book as well? Yeah.
Yeah, it was an intentional effort to bring these two things together in the book and to try to think about them not as being in opposition to one another, but as existing on this kind of spectrum of understanding, a spectrum of, as Gifty would put it, like a way of seeing the world, a way of thinking about the world. I grew up religious. I grew up in the church, and was raised by religious Ghanaian parents. Whenever we're in Ghana, we go to CCC. Like I've had the whole experience, and so for me, that background, that history, that understanding of what faith provides to people, what it has given to people that I know and love dearly. It was important to me that the book not, completely write off faith, completely write off religion, but that it held space for the idea that there are other ways of thinking about the world, other ways of asking large, meaningful questions about what it means to be alive and why we're here and how we make sense of our lives. So yeah, from the beginning, it was an attempt to think about these things as existing on a spectrum, not necessarily as being opposed.
I want to pick on what Abdullah just said. He asked, Transcendent Kingdom at some points gets very intense, and I can imagine a lot of research was done, especially the science aspect, because at a point I was thinking, oh, is Yaa Gyasi from a science background? And then I had to reread your bio and say, oh, no, she isn't. And so you have mentioned that you are slowly learning how to not be afraid of how your work is taken once it gets into the world. But then Transcendent Kingdom, as I said, does get heavy. How were you able to first draw the line of getting too intense in the research that is shown in Transcendent Kingdom and still highlighting the fictional part of it? And what are your thoughts on writing on heavy themes? Because both books are on heavy themes. Do you feel that your work is not to entertain because writing is in itself to entertain? So these are my 2 questions.
Well, with Transcendent Kingdom, part of the way that it came about was because of my friend's research, and she was doing research into addiction and depression, and I found it really, really fascinating just from the science perspective, like to hear her talk about the neuroscience behind that work. And so I knew that I would always kind of include some aspect of it that would be heavily researched, that I would try as best I could to embody the mind of a scientist, which was new for me. I hadn't taken a science class, in over a decade at that point. But research is always a pleasure for me. So it felt like an opportunity to learn about something completely different from the things that I spend my days thinking about. And then, I don't know, it's as though writing is, if you were being given plastic wrap and you try to make a house out of it. So you're trying to figure out put the research that you're getting, that you're thinking about, into a work that will stand on its own. As long as you're focusing on, again, on the character, on what their lives look like and feel like, the story will start to take shape on its own. You don't have to worry too much, I think, about making sure everything fits exactly correctly. Like just the process of thinking about this character will start to draw out the parts of the research that are relevant to the work.
And then on the thoughts of writing on heavy themes, which both books do, is it an intention to write on these themes, and do you write not to entertain but to explore certain themes that many humans may be dealing with?
Well, I think I'm writing mostly in order to kind of create a sense of order for myself, in order to kind of try to parse out my own thinking about things that I see in the world, things that I have questions about, things that kind of consume me. And so it doesn't feel like a form of entertainment necessarily, because I'm usually not thinking too deeply about audience, at least from a first draft perspective. I'm just trying to sort out my own feelings, my own thoughts, and kind of create, again, like a kind of shape to this world that feels shapeless otherwise. And so part of my thinking around like writing about heavy topics is that so many of us are, like, obviously we're living these quiet, intimate lives, but we are being impacted by larger forces constantly. And the way that those two things connect, kind of large-scale political things in our own small lives, is really fascinating. That's where all of our lives happen, is that intersection between what we think of as kind of large and heavy, and what's small and intimate. And so it feels like an opportunity to write about the way that life is lived, to include those themes. I can't imagine not doing that.
Thank you. I'd like to know how we are doing with time, and then we'll take one last reading, a few sets of questions, and then we can end for 10 minutes.
I have one more question.
Yeah. So how are we doing with time? How much more time do we have? We have to.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Yaa Gyasi is currently on tour with Transcendent Kingdom. So I would ask that you do a reading from that book, and then we'll take the last two questions from Martina.
And so this is from Transcendent Kingdom, and it's toward the middle of the book, and it's Gifty, the main character, when she's in college. My sophomore year at Harvard was particularly brutal. The magic of my sad lamp had worn off, and I spent much of that winter trudging to class through snow that came up to my waist. I taught my mother how to make video calls on her computer, so sometimes I would call her, thinking I would tell her how unhappy I was, but then her face would greet me on the screen, confused and annoyed by the technology, and I'd lose my resolve, not wanting to add my burdens to her own. To make matters worse, I was barely hanging on in my integrated science course. I did fine on the homework and the tests, but the course had a project lab component that required working in small groups, and every day, as I sat mutely in class, I watched my participation points plummet. The class would really benefit from hearing your thoughts, my professor would sometimes write on the top of my assignments. Later, in my dorm, I would rehearse the kinds of things I might say, telling my reflection about all of my project ideas, but then class time would roll around, and my professor's eyes would fall on me, and I would clam up. My small group started ignoring me. Sometimes, when the class split up to work on our projects, my group would form a circle with me on the outside. I'd shoulder my way in, or, more often than not, wait for someone to notice. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, yeah, for that final reading. So I just have a couple more questions for you. What new writing projects do you have in the pipeline?
I am working on something new, but I'm superstitious about saying what exactly I'm working on when I'm working on it.
Fair enough.
Mostly because the process for me is at the beginning is so shapeless for me that it's hard to know what I'm actually doing until I finish a first draft. And so it always feels like anything that I would say about it would be a lie by the time I finish the book.
Yes, I understand that. And sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah. No, that's okay.
I was going to say, from other things you said, it's clear that your books, you allow your stories to develop a life of their own, and then to determine things like the theme and the plot, and so on. So I totally understand that. Yes. Well, whatever it is, we can't wait. And the final question is one about that in a way goes back to the cross-continental links and all the challenges and joys of moving between the spaces, the different spaces in which you have belonging. But I'd like to take it to a literary context. And to ground it, I would like to remind you of how we first met back in 2014. Yes, I knew Yaa before she became famous. And we met in Iowa when I was on the International Writing Program in 2014 on the fall residency, and Yaa was still in the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is a master's program in the University of Iowa. I gave a reading in a bookshop called Prairie Lights, which hosts many readings by the university students in Iowa. And I was lucky enough to have Yaa and at least 3 other African or diasporan African students present. And in my reading, part of the reading, I was channeling a charismatic priest. And you know how, effusive they can be. So I would say, as part of the reading, say amen. And then these 4 African students would go, amen. So say, I hear you, Lord. And they went, I hear you, Lord. And it was fantastic because we were in Iowa City. And to get that kind of response, they said that was one of the liveliest readings they'd ever had. And it just felt so wonderful to sort of have my people there. And I think we can strengthen our literary community if we link up the diasporan writers with the writers in the home country. And to me, that was a moment where I kind of felt that, and I think we can feel that both away from here and here. We're very privileged to have had you give your first interview in Africa, although you're not physically here. You're virtually here with us, and we're very proud that we've been able to do that. And so I would like to ask you, are there any other particular ways in which you would like to be involved with the literary scene here in Ghana?
Sure, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I would love to be there physically at some point. It's nice to do the virtual.
We have witnesses.
But as we have all experienced this year, there's a kind of virtual fatigue. And so you recognize that what you miss most about, at least I recognize that what I miss most about book tours, getting to see the people and hearing from them about what the books have meant to them and what they're working on, and so that's been a loss. So it would be nice to go to Ghana and to do that.
Okay, wonderful. And I think on that note, we'd like to thank you ever so much for joining us tonight. Oh, sorry, more questions?
Yes.
I thought we had run out of time. Okay.
Yes, we actually have, but there are so many questions, so I'll just take a few of them.
Okay, yeah. Are you okay to take a couple more questions? Okay.
Sure.
So this is coming from Phil Ajay, and he says, how do you imbibe the feelings of things that you may not have experienced personally in your writing? And then, so that's one. This is another one coming from Instagram. This is from NY, the traveler. It says, what is it like for you when you read to an all-white audience? Do you have to adapt somehow, or is it just another audience? then it's a question to a writer more than a political question, and so that's added to it. And then Lutard says that many fiction writers in particular are very versatile. You write in any other genre, and if so, will you be publishing that work? I think this question was handled earlier on.
Yeah.
So there are a few others from Zoom. I think I should just put all of them together, and maybe Yaa can answer the ones which he remembers, so that we can save up on time. And apologies because we actually have overshot. Nilante Lamte asks, which Ghanaian writers have influenced your writing, or whose writing you do enjoy? And then someone asked, who is your favorite African or Ghanaian writer? Sorry, there's someone, is Evelyn Kuben Doku. Okay, and then I have here also from Ikuya, who is on Zoom. She says, do you ever write by voice recording your thoughts? And then Alice Walker says, then Joyce comes in and says, Alice Walker, for example, also said the characters of The Color Purple visit her. And so, yes, I'll leave it here. There are several more, but I think maybe you can take a stab at answering this.
We'll have to have another session, yeah.
As for the question about how to write about things that you have not personally experienced, I think that it takes some practice, but I think one thing that is really helpful to remember is that reading is almost more important than writing. The books that you read, not just for research or not just the kind of historical or nonfiction text that you're using to bolster the world of your fiction, but other fiction, and thinking about how to approach subjects that you don't really know much about, that only sharpens your own work. And so that's the beginning of your imagination, I think, is the reading. For African writers that I love Ama Taipu. Changes in particular is a hugely important book to me. I really like Taye Selassie. I love a mutual friend of Mamle and ours, Derek Monroe, who has a book coming out.
What Napoleon could not do.
I think.
Yeah, what Napoleon could not do, watch out for it.
Exactly, look out for that. And also from my time at Iowa, a writer named Nana Nkwati, who was Cameroonian American.
She was nominated for the Caine Prize last year.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then I also am interested in the kind of what I think of as the 1.5 generation African writer, people like Dinao Mengistu or Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, who are writing as I experience like between cultures. That's interesting to me as well. So yeah, that's a handful. And I can't remember any of the other questions.
Martin, do you want to give a refresher, or should we wrap up?
So,
I think there was a question on how your experience of reading to a white audience, if it's different, or if it's just like reading to any other audience.
Well, the reading is the same. I'm just question that I will get in a Q&A, the things that people are interested in hearing about, interested in talking about, that differs according to the audience. As it would, here in this event, I'm getting questions about Ghana, historical accuracy, identity. If I were reading to a white audience in the States, I'm often getting questions that have to do more with kind of the history of enslavement here, what their role in it is, what they might do. If I'm reading to African Americans, I often get questions about, interestingly, a lot of questions about the genealogy, people who are, seeking out their own histories, their own stories. So I find that the experience of reading is the same, but the events change according to what people want to know, and also according to what people have done.
Okay, so this has been a wonderful evening with Ghanaian American writer Yaa Gyasi, who is the author of Transcendent Kingdom, which has been shortlisted for the 2021 Women's Prize for Fiction, and Homegoing, which has also won a lot of awards. Thank you, Yaa Gyasi, for honoring our invitation, and we do hope that in the near future we would be experiencing you here in Ghana or virtually in other ways. I have just one announcement to make from the Writers Project, and then we can call it a night. And we have had audiences, the biggest live audience. So I'd just like to say thank you for coming despite the COVID. And also, we've also had an audience all across Africa. And so if you're joining us on Zoom, on Instagram, on Facebook, sending in WhatsApp messages, however you can, thank you so much for joining this conversation. I'd like to say that the Writers Project of Ghana will be having the 5th edition of its literary festival, PIJA, a literary festival in Accra, and that would be from the 15th to the 17th of October. So we will make announcements. And so mark the dates. You can join us in Ghana for the festival, and we do assure that it would be an experience like no other. Yeah, Gyasi, thank you so much once again. And if you have any last comments before you go.
No, just to say thank you to both of you for these questions. Thank you to Martin for helping to organize, and thank you to everyone who showed up today. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, yeah. So follow the Writers Project of Ghana on Twitter at WritersPG, on Instagram at WritersPG. Check out our website, writersprojectghana.com, for details of more events. This is a monthly event, and so you can see who will be hosting next month. We do have an exciting name again in the month of August. Have a good evening. My name is Elizabeth Johnson, and I have been doing this with Mamle Kabu, who is also a writer. So check out her books. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, yeah, once again.